ever feel like, love has you in a chokehold? You know, that feeling where you need to keep someone close, but you're terrified that holding on too tight might be what pushes them away?
Yeah, yeah.
Today, we're tackling that tricky terrain of jealousy and possessiveness.
That's a good one.
We're doing a deep dive into this podcast called Jealousy and Possessiveness: The Path to Violence in Relationships.
Uh-huh.
And before you think, oh, this isn't about me, trust me, it really gets into the nitty-gritty of power dynamics and stuff that I think we can all relate to, not just romantic relationships.
Oh, absolutely. And what I found so interesting about this podcast was how it really unpacked the psychology behind these emotions. It's not just surface level insecurity, like, oh, I'm worried about losing my partner. It often stems from this deeper fear of inadequacy. Like, are we subconsciously worried that we're not enough? And that can manifest in this almost desperate need for control.
It's so true. Like, think about, have you ever had that experience maybe at work where your favorite coworker gets that promotion that, maybe you were like kind of hoping for,
Yeah.
and you're happy for them, obviously, but then there's this little voice that creaks in like, wait, am I not good enough? Should that have been me? And suddenly you're like, you're the one staying late. You're the one like going above and beyond, just like trying to overcompensate.
Absolutely. You're trying to prove your worth, right?
Yes.
And that's where it can become, you go from that healthy competition into like possessiveness almost.
Yeah.
You see that in workplaces. You see it in friendships, families, really any dynamic where there's like a power structure.
Yeah.
Someone feels threatened and their reaction is to try to control the situation or the people in it.
So to be clear, I mean, feeling a twinge of jealousy now and then is totally normal, right? It's when it festers and then morphs into those controlling behaviors. That's when things get like messy.
It's a spectrum, right?
Right.
I mean, we all experience those pangs of insecurity, but the podcast really teased apart the differences between, say, feeling a little envious of your friend's new car
Yeah.
versus needing to know your partner's every move.
Right.
That's where that possessiveness comes in, and
Mhm.
often it backfires.
Because you're trying to control someone, and
Right.
that just breeds more distrust, which then pushes them further away, right?
Yeah, it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy,
Yeah.
this toxic cycle that's so hard to break free from.
Okay, so let's break down this whole toxic cycle thing a bit more, because this is where the podcast episode really got me thinking. The expert they interviewed, I think it was Dr. Lewis, used this phrase, toxic cycle,
Mm.
and it really stuck with me. They were describing how someone's jealousy, right, can then lead to these controlling behaviors,
Right.
which then escalate into something, even more serious, like aggression or even violence. And it's almost like a pressure cooker,
Yeah.
where things just build and build and build until like something has to give.
And what's important to remember, too, is this isn't limited to romantic relationships.
Right.
This toxic cycle can really rear its ugly head in any type of relationship where you have these power dynamics and those deeper insecurities at play.
You're so right. I'm even thinking about like a close friend group, right? Where you have that one friend who always has to be the center of attention. They monopolize every conversation, always steering the topic back to themselves somehow.
Yeah.
And it can be subtle,
Right.
but those little pangs of jealousy might start to bubble up in the other friends.
Absolutely. And without even realizing it, those other friends might start, competing for that attention,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Talking over each other, trying to
Yeah.
like one-up each other's stories.
Yeah.
That's jealousy fueling this subtle form of possessiveness.
Yes.
It's like they need to reclaim their position in the group.
It's like that saying, comparison is the thief of joy.
Yeah.
But it's like, in this case, it's not just our joy that's being stolen. It's like the whole dynamic of the friendship,
Exactly. The podcast also talks about the impact these cycles have on bystanders, which I thought was interesting because a lot of times it's,
It's not just the people directly
yeah,
involved.
exactly.
That's so true. And it makes me think about those personal stories that they shared. Listener A's experience was just so powerful. They actually said, you're not going to believe this. They said, at first, I thought my partner's jealousy was sweet.
Oh, wow.
Which is just, it's heartbreaking, right?
Yeah.
Because you're mistaking those early warning signs, right?
Yeah.
Like those initial attempts to control, you're mistaking those as some kind of misguided affection.
Yeah, it's easy to see how that happens, though,
It
right?
is.
Especially at the beginning of a relationship. You get those grand gestures, the constant attention.
Oh, yeah.
It's intoxicating. But like they were saying in the podcast, there's often this darker side lurking beneath the surface.
And that's where listener B's story is so important because they were actually a bystander, like witnessing this toxic cycle play out in a friend's relationship.
Wow.
And it just made me realize how important it is to be aware of those signs, not just in our own lives, but in the lives of the people that we care about.
It makes you wonder how we break free, though, right? Like,
Yeah.
how do we actually escape this? It can feel like you're, stuck in emotional quicksand or something,
Yeah.
especially when those patterns are so deeply ingrained.
It really can. And that feeling of being stuck, that's exactly what keeps people in these cycles for so long.
Right.
But and this is where I felt like the podcast offered some real hope. There are practical things we can do. It all starts with communication,
Okay.
but not just any communication.
Right.
It has to be open and honest communication.
So it's like instead of leading with accusations like, who are you texting?
It's more like, hey, when this happened, it made me feel insecure.
Exactly. And equally important is being receptive to what your partner or your friend or even your coworker is expressing to you, right?
Yeah,
Because remember, jealousy often comes from a place of vulnerability.
that's true.
So if we can approach those conversations with empathy, that can make a world of difference.
The podcast also really emphasized the importance of setting boundaries, which I'll admit I used to think of as like, oh, you're building walls.
Yeah.
But they really framed it as like, you're creating a safe and respectful space within the relation, whatever that relationship may be.
Because boundaries are about protecting everyone involved.
Right.
It's not about punishment or control.
Totally. And it made me think of the situation I had years ago with a partner who always needed to know my every move.
Mhm.
And it was exhausting. And I finally realized I had to set a boundary around my own need for independence.
Yeah.
And we talked it through, and thankfully he was receptive to it. And it actually brought us closer because it built trust.
That's a perfect example of how boundaries, when communicated effectively and respected, can actually deepen intimacy rather than create that distance.
Right.
And sometimes we need a little help navigating those conversations.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Like it's okay to not have all the answers.
Totally.
And the podcast, I thought, made a really important point about seeking professional help if those patterns are still persisting.
Yes.
It is a sign of strength, not weakness, to be able to say,
Right.
hey, I need some support in working through this.
100%.
A therapist can give you those tools and strategies for healthier communication and conflict resolution, which can be so invaluable in terms of actually breaking free from those toxic cycles for good.
It's so true.
Yeah.
So after listening to this podcast and then, really kind of dissecting it with you, I'm left feeling like jealousy is way more common than we realize. And that often those possessive tendencies are really just a cry for something much deeper.
It's about understanding the root of those emotions, right? Both in ourselves and in the people that we're in relationships with. And, recognizing those patterns, that's a huge step towards breaking free from them and building relationships, whether they're romantic, platonic, professional, whatever that looks like, but building them on a foundation of trust and respect.
It's a journey. It's not a destination.
And sometimes that journey involves, seeking a little guidance and support along the way.
Well said. Well, hopefully this deep dive, gave our listeners some things to think about in their own lives and maybe even spark some important conversations with the people that they love.
I hope so.
As always, thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. It was a fascinating conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, we'll see you next time.